On a bright spring morning in early May 1945, a 25-year-old man named Magnus von Braun rode a bicycle down a mountain road in the Bavarian Alps looking for American soldiers. He was holding a white handkerchief tied to a stick. Magnus spoke the best English of anyone in his group, which was why he was the one on the bike. The war in Europe had just 6 days left, though nobody on that road knew it yet. His older brother Wernher was back at the hotel in the village of Oberjoch near the Austrian border with about 125 other German rocket engineers. They were the core team that had built the V-2 rocket, and they had spent the previous several weeks moving south through a collapsing country, dodging two different sets of people that wanted to find them. The first was the SS, who had standing orders to execute the rocket team rather than let them be captured by the Allies. The second was the Allies themselves, whom Wernher very much wanted to be captured by, provided he could choose which ones. He didn't want to be captured by the Russians, he wanted to be captured by the Americans. Magnus rode down the mountain looking for the Americans. He found a private from the U.S. 44th Infantry Division standing on a road that wound through pine forest. In careful, accented English, Magnus explained that his older brother had invented the V-2 rocket and would like to surrender, along with the rest of the team, and would the Americans please come and collect them. The private didn't believe him at first. By nightfall, the most valuable group of scientific prisoners of the Second World War was in American custody. Within 2 years, most of them would be living in Texas, and then 10 years later, most of them would be living in Alabama, working for the United States Army. Within 24 years, the man on the bicycle's brother would be standing at Cape Kennedy watching a rocket he designed carry 3 Americans toward the moon. I'm Lorne Bregitzer, a professor at the University of Colorado Denver's College of Arts and Media, and on Everything is Gray, we try to make sense of something that's rarely simple, how the artists and scientists we admire and the things they've done shape the way we see their work and ourselves. This is the story of Wernher von Braun, the man who took us to the moon. And about the pronunciation of his name, it changes over the course of his career when he's in Germany and then when he moves to America. The man who built the weapons that killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp. The man whose rocket killed more people in its construction than it ever killed in flight. He was protected from any of that by 2 different governments, because both governments wanted what he could build, and neither of them was going to ask too many questions about what it cost to build it. The story most people know about Wernher von Braun is the second half. The Saturn V and Apollo 11, his German accent on Walt Disney's television show explaining how humans would one day live on the moon. We're going to spend most of this episode on the first half, not because the second half doesn't matter, but because you can't understand what the second half cost until you understand who paid for it. The people who paid were not Americans, and they were not Germans, and most of them never got to choose. This is the story of how a boy who loved rockets grew up to build them for Hitler, and how the United States government took the man and washed his record clean enough to put him on the cover of Time magazine and was the face of multiple Disney programs. This is the story about how the rocket that took us to the moon was the same rocket as the one that fell on a Woolworths in London on a Saturday afternoon in 1944. This is also the story of his younger brother on a bicycle on a mountain road who didn't know what he was doing when he did it. This is how it happened. Wernher von Braun was born on March 23, 1912, in a small town called Wiersitz, in what was then the eastern edge of the German Empire, which is now part of Poland. His family was of minor aristocracy, the kind that had a von in the name and a coat of arms on the silverware, but not much else. His father, Magnus von Braun, the elder, was a civil servant who would eventually serve as a minister of agriculture in one of the last Weimar governments before the Nazis took power. His mother, Emmy, traced her ancestry back to medieval European royalty on both sides, the kind of pedigree that mattered erroneously in the world she was raised in, but almost not at all in the world her sons would inherit. For Wernher's Lutheran confirmation when he was 13, his mother gave him a telescope. That's the kind of detail that sounds like part of a perfect fairy tale, but it's not. It's in every biography, and it shows up in his own letters and interviews. The telescope did what telescopes do to those types of children. It pointed at the sky and decided, with a totality of conviction available only to a 13-year-old, that he was going to find a way to get up there. The path he took to that decision was not initially scientific. As a boy, he was a mediocre student, especially in math and physics, the 2 subjects he would later need most. What changed him was a book. In 1925, he got a copy of a book by Hermann Oberth, which is a title I can't pronounce, but it translates to The Rocket into Interplanetary Space, which was one of the foundational texts of early rocketry. He couldn't understand most of the math in it, so he taught himself the math. By the time he was 16, he had caught up to and passed his classmates in the subjects that had previously held him back, and he was running rocket experiments in the courtyard of his boarding school. One of those experiments involved strapping fireworks to a child's wagon and setting them off in a public street in Berlin. The wagon went farther than expected. The police wound up getting involved as the father had to come collect him. In 1929, at 17, von Braun joined an organization called the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, the Society for Space Travel, an amateur rocket club that operated out of a former ammunition dump on the outskirts of Berlin. The club called the place the Raketenflugplatz, or Rocket Airfield. It was a few hundred yards of concrete and weeds with a couple of test stands welded together out of scrap metal. The members were mostly engineering students, hobbyists, and unemployed dreamers. They were doing genuinely cutting-edge work on liquid-fueled rocket engines, the kind of work that nobody else in the world was doing seriously at that time. And they did this with almost no money. They begged for components from machine shops, scavenged tanks and valves from junkyards, and tested engines that occasionally exploded and sent everyone diving behind the concrete walls. Von Braun loved it. By every account from the people who were there, he was the most enthusiastic person at the Raketenflugplatz, the one who showed up first and left last, the one who could be counted on to chase a runaway test rig across a field. He was also, even at 17, a natural organizer and salesman. He gave demonstrations to journalists. Von Braun wrote letters to potential donors. He was comfortable with the idea that his work needed an audience and a check, which is a skill that the older engineers lacked. The thing to say honestly here before anything else is that the dream was real. Von Braun wanted to build rockets to go to space. He'd wanted that since he was 13, and he would want it for the rest of his life. Almost everything he did from that point forward, every choice he made, every compromise he accepted, can be traced to a young man's certainty that he was going to be the one that got humanity off the planet. That dream didn't stop being real because of what happened next. It's also not an excuse for what happened next. Both things will be true for the rest of his life. And this show is built on the discomfort of holding both truths at the same time. In 1932, the German army showed up at the rocket field. They included an army captain named Walter Dornberger, a career artillery veteran who'd been given a small budget and a vague mandate to investigate whether liquid-fueled rockets could be turned into weapons. The army noticed something interesting about the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty, which had been imposed on Germany at the end of the First World War, banned the country from developing long-range artillery, heavy bombers, and most of the other tools of offensive warfare, but it said nothing about rockets, because in 1919, nobody at the negotiating table had thought rockets were going to be a thing. 14 years later, the German army had thought about it, and the loophole was looking very interesting. Dornberger watched the amateur rocketeers run their tests. He was unimpressed by most of what he saw, but he was impressed by Wernher von Braun. He offered the young man a job. "Come work for the army," Dornberger said. "You'll have a real budget, a real laboratory, and the ability to build rockets at a scale you can't even imagine from this concrete pad." The army would pay for everything. The only condition was that the work would be classified as military research, which meant that von Braun would not be able to publish his results, give public lectures, or talk about what he was doing to anyone outside the program. Von Braun was 20 years old when he took that deal. He's been defended on this point for 90 years, and the defense is worth taking seriously because parts of it are true. In 1932, the Nazis were not yet in power. Hitler wouldn't become chancellor until January of 1933. The contract Dornberger offered was with the Weimar Reichswehr, the military of a democratic government, however troubled that government had become. Von Braun was not signing with the Third Reich because the Third Reich didn't exist yet. He was signing on with a national army that had been quietly looking for ways around a treaty most Germans considered unjust, which was a different thing, even if the line between those two things turned out to be thinner than anyone would later admit. That defense holds up for about 13 months. After January of 1933, none of it did. When Hitler came to power, von Braun's contract didn't change. His work didn't slow down, and he wouldn't quit. He didn't transfer to a civilian program because there was no longer a civilian rocket program of any seriousness in Germany. The Amateur Society for Space Travel had collapsed in 1934, partly because of money and partly because the Gestapo had begun showing up at meetings and asking questions. The only place to do rocket work in Germany was inside the military. The military now answered to Hitler, and von Braun answered to the military. He has said in interviews given decades later that he viewed the army funding as a deal with the devil he could manage. That phrase, "a deal with the devil," is his own. The work moved fast. By 1934, von Braun had a doctorate in physics from the University of Berlin, a degree he completed in 2 years while running a military research program full-time. The dissertation was classified by the Army before he'd finished writing it and remained classified until after the war. By 1937, the rocket program had outgrown its facilities outside Berlin, and the Army built him a new home for his work on the Baltic coast, on a peninsula called Peenemünde. He was 25 years old at this time, and he was technical director of the largest rocket development program in the world. He had something like 1,500 people working under him by the end of the decade. In 1937, he also joined the Nazi Party. He would later say he had to. He would say his career would have ended otherwise, and that his life might have ended too. The historical record is genuinely mixed on how true that is. Other German scientists in similar positions refused party membership and survived. A few refused and didn't. The pressure there was real, but the pressure was not always as absolute as he later claimed. What's not in dispute is that he signed the form, and he carried the membership card, and in turn he kept his job. In 1940, he accepted an SS commission, eventually rising to the rank of Sturmbannführer, which is to say a major. By his own account of this, given to American interrogators after the war, was that Heinrich Himmler had personally pressured him into joining, and he had viewed the membership as ceremonial. Photographs exist of him in that uniform, and he isn't smiling in them, but he is wearing them, and the runes on that collar are unmistakable. The work at Peenemünde through the late 30s and early 40s focused on a project called the A4, which would later be named the V2 once it became operational, and the propaganda ministry needed a name with more snap to it. The full name translates to Vengeance Weapon 2. It was a liquid-fueled ballistic missile 46 feet tall, capable of carrying a 1-ton high-explosive warhead about 200 miles at supersonic speed. It was the first object ever built by human hands to reach the edge of space. The first successful test flight came on October 3, 1942. The rocket went up about 53 miles and came down 120 miles away, and the team at Peenemünde celebrated. Walter Dornberger, who had just been promoted from captain to general over the years he had been managing von Braun, gave a small speech at the celebration that night. He said, and this part is on the record because several people wrote it down later, that today the spaceship had been born. He also said that their task now was to perfect it as a weapon of war. Von Braun was in the room. He raised a glass with everyone else. The dream had moved one step closer, and the cost of moving it closer was about to start coming due. Chapter 2. What the Rocket Was For. The V2 became operational in September of 1944. By that point in the war, Germany was losing on every front. The Allies had landed in Normandy 3 months earlier and were pushing east. The Soviets were grinding their way through Poland. The cities of the Reich were being bombed almost nightly by the British and the Americans, and the German civilian population was beginning for the first time to understand that the war was going to end and that they were going to lose it. Hitler needed a weapon that would change the calculation. He'd been promised one for years, and the V2 was supposed to be it. The first V2 fired in anger hit Paris on the morning of September 8, 1944. The second one hit Chiswick in West London the same day. Over the next 7 months, roughly 3,000 V2s were launched at Allied cities, primarily London and the Belgian city of Antwerp, which the Allies had recently captured and were using as their main supply hub for the Western Front. The warhead was about a ton of high explosive. The V2 rocket arrived at supersonic speed, which meant that civilians on the ground heard nothing until the explosion. There was no air raid siren that could warn you because at the time, the sirens depended on spotters seeing or hearing aircraft, and there was nothing to see or hear. There was no shelter that meant anything, because the warhead penetrated several feet of earth or concrete before it detonated. The first thing you knew about the V2 was the building that you were in, or the street you were on, ceasing to exist. About 9,000 civilians died from V2 strikes during those 7 months, with another 9,000 or so seriously wounded. The single deadliest strike on London came on the afternoon of November 25, 1944, when a V2 struck a Woolworths department store on New Cross Road. It was a Saturday afternoon. The store had just received a shipment of saucepans which were rationed and almost impossible to find during wartime Britain, and a queue had formed around the block. 168 people were killed in a single explosion. Many of them were women who had brought their children with them while they shopped. The youngest victim was an infant. The oldest was in her 70s, and the rescue effort took several days because the wreckage was so dense that bodies had to be recovered piece by piece. 3 weeks later, on December 16, 1944, another V2 struck the Cinerex Theater in central Antwerp during an afternoon screening of a Gary Cooper Western called The Plainsman. The theater was packed. More than half the audience was Allied soldiers on leave. 567 people were killed. It remains the single deadliest V2 strike of the war, and one of the single deadliest explosions of the entire European theater outside of strategic bombing campaigns and the atomic weapons used on Japan. These are the things the V2 was for. Not space or the moon. The Woolworths and the cinema. A queue of women buying saucepans on a Saturday afternoon. A theater full of soldiers on leave watching a Gary Cooper movie 3 weeks before Christmas. But the V2's casualty figure has a second number attached to it, and the second number is larger than the first. In August of 1943, the British launched a massive bombing raid in Peenemünde. The raid was called Operation Hydra and involved nearly 600 heavy bombers attacking the rocket facility over the course of a single night. The damage to the production facilities was significant, but the more important effect was strategic. The German leadership concluded that the V2 manufacturing could not continue at an exposed coastal site that the British clearly knew about and could find again. The decision was made to move production underground, into a tunnel complex being dug into the side of a mountain in the Harz in central Germany. The complex was called Mittelwerk, which translates roughly as Middle Works, and it was built and operated by slave labor from a concentration camp called Mittelbau-Dora. Dora began as a subcamp of Buchenwald in the summer of 1943, and it became its own independent camp system in October of 1944. The prisoners came from every category of person the Nazi regime considered disposable. Soviet prisoners of war who'd been captured on the Eastern Front. They included political prisoners from Germany itself, communists and socialists and labor organizers who'd been in the camp since 1933. French resistance members captured after D-Day. Polish civilians swept up in mass deportations. Jewish prisoners transferred from other camps when the Nazi machinery of extermination began running out of victims and started running its surviving prisoners even harder. By the time the camp was liberated in April 1945, prisoners from more than 20 countries had passed through it. The work they were forced to do was unsurvivable. The first task, in the second half of 1943, was to dig the tunnels themselves out of the mountain. The prisoners worked 12-hour shifts with hand tools and inadequate explosives in conditions that almost defy description. They slept in the tunnels they were digging, on bunks improvised from scrap wood. 4 or 5 men to a bunk, in air thick with rock dust and human waste. There was no plumbing in there. There was, for months, no running water. Prisoners drank from puddles that formed where groundwater seeped through the rock. The death rate during the tunneling phase was the highest in the entire concentration camp system outside of the extermination camps, which is a sentence that should not be possible to write, but it is true. Once the tunnels were finished and rocket production began, conditions improved marginally, in the sense that the prisoners were no longer sleeping in the same place they were digging. They were moved to a barracks complex outside the tunnel mouth, and they marched into the production lines each morning and marched back out each night. The work was assembly of the V2 itself, which required precise tolerances and skilled labor, and the SS quickly learned that prisoners who were starving to death produced more defective rockets than prisoners who were merely starving. So the rations at Dora were marginally better than the rations at the worst of the camps, while still being insufficient to sustain a person doing manual labor. Prisoners typically lost between 30 and 50 pounds in their first month at Dora, and most didn't have it to lose to begin with. Beatings were routine at the facility. Hangings were public, and they were used as both punishment and demonstration. The SS would sometimes hang prisoners from the same overhead crane that was used to move rocket components down the production line, leaving the bodies in place while the production line continued running underneath them. This is documented in multiple survivor accounts and in post-war trial testimony. The purpose wasn't concealed. The bodies were a message to the prisoners about what would happen to them if production fell behind. And they were a message to the engineers about whose schedule was being kept. Approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through the camp system during its operation. At least 20,000 of them died from starvation, disease, exhaustion, exposure, beatings, and executions. And this estimate is conservative. The actual number is probably higher, because record keeping at the camp was deliberately incomplete, and many prisoners were transferred out shortly before death so that the camp's mortality figures would look better on the paperwork. That number is larger than the number of civilians killed by the V2s. More people died building the rocket than were killed by the rocket. So the question, the one that's been argued for about 80 years, is what Wernher von Braun knew and what he didn't, and what he could have done differently. The version of the story he told for the rest of his life was a careful one, and it deserves to be presented fairly before we look at what's wrong with it. He was the technical director of the rocket program, and his responsibilities were technical. He visited Mittelwerk on multiple occasions, yes, and he saw prisoners working there, yes. And he was aware the conditions were bad. But he wasn't in the chain of command for the camp itself. He had no authority over how prisoners were treated, no power to discipline SS guards, and no input into rations or housing or punishment. The day-to-day operations of Dora was run by SS men whose names were not Wernher von Braun. Men who were tried and convicted at Nuremberg and at the Dachau trials after the war. He was a scientist who had been given a job to do under a regime he didn't personally choose, and he did the job. And he tried where he could to make conditions slightly better for the workers under his technical supervision. Some of that defense is partly true. He was not an SS camp officer. He didn't personally beat prisoners. He did, on at least 2 occasions that are documented, intervene with the SS on behalf of specific prisoners who were technical specialists he wanted preserved, and those interventions saved those specific prisoners' lives. The rest of the defense is harder to defend. Von Braun visited Mittelwerk at least a dozen times that we know of, and possibly more. The visits are documented in the camp's own records, and in post-war testimony of survivors and SS officers alike. He walked the production floor, and he saw prisoners working, and he saw the conditions they were working in. In a letter he wrote in 1969, 24 years after the war and 15 years into his American career, he described the conditions at Mittelwerk as repulsive, and said he had personally seen prisoners who had been beaten. That letter is in the historical record in his own handwriting. There is also another letter in his handwriting. It was written on August 15, 1944, while the war was still on and he was still working at Mittelwerk. The letter was addressed to a colleague named Albin Javatsky, and it concerned a request for additional prison labor for a specific technical task. In the letter, von Braun explained that he had personally selected, on a recent visit to Buchenwald, a number of prisoners with the specific skills the program needed, and he asked Javatsky to ensure the transfer to Mittelwerk so the work could proceed. He referred to the prisoners by their skill categories, the way you would refer to parts in a supply chain. Both of these letters exist. The man who in 1969 was repulsed by what he had seen was the same man who in 1944 had personally selected prisoners from a concentration camp for transfer to the labor system that was killing them. There's no honest version of his biography that gets him out of this. There is a version where he's not personally cruel, where he didn't invent the system of slave labor that built his rocket, where he might have even privately disapproved of what he was seeing. That version may well be true, but the system existed and he used it, and he kept using it for as long as the war lasted. The rocket was built by men who were starving to death in tunnels under a mountain, and he knew and he used what they built, and he kept building. This show is built around specificity, and so I want to be specific about one survivor in particular. There was a prisoner at Mittelwerk named Yves Bayon. He was a French resistance fighter captured in 1943 and sent to Buchenwald, then transferred to Dora when production began. He survived the camp, survived the death march at the end of the war when the SS evacuated Dora ahead of the advancing Americans, and survived to write a memoir of his time there, which was published in French in 1985, and an English translation a few years later. The memoir is called Planet Dora, and it's one of the most important first-person accounts we have of what the prison was like on the inside. Bayon described in detail seeing engineers in suits walking the production line. They carried clipboards and they took notes. They discussed technical problems with the SS officers who were supervising their work. They moved through the tunnels with the easy authority of men who had legitimate business there, but they didn't seem to register the people as prisoners, or if they did, the registration didn't slow them down. Bayon was clear about what he was describing. He was not describing men who were horrified and powerless. He was describing men who were working. The engineers in suits had names, and one of them was Wernher von Braun. I'm going to say one more thing here and then move on, because dwelling on this risks becoming its own kind of moral failure. The kind where the narrator stays in the horror long enough to feel like he's paid respects and then moves on with the story. The story we tell about the V2 is the story of a weapon that killed thousands of civilians in cities. That story is true, and the dead in London and Antwerp deserve to be remembered, and the names on the memorial of Chiswick and the plaque of Cinerex are the real names of real people who were killed by a weapon that shouldn't have existed. But the larger story is about the people who built the weapon and the conditions they built it under. The dead of Mittelbau Dora, the men who died in the tunnels and in the bunks that were not bunks, in the snow outside the tunnel mouth where the bodies were stacked because the crematorium couldn't keep up. Those dead are remembered less. They were remembered less at the time, and they're remembered even less now. And the reason for that is that the engineer who oversaw the building of the rocket they died building went on to a long and celebrated American career, and the men who lived long enough to bear witness to what had happened to them didn't have that kind of platform. When Magnus von Braun rode his bicycle down the mountain in May of 1945, he wasn't just surrendering a man. He was surrendering an account that had yet to be settled. The Americans weren't going to settle it. The Americans were going to pay it off, and they were going to look the other way. And the people they were paying it off with were not their dollars to spend. Chapter 3. The Laundering. The program was originally called Operation Overcast, but it was renamed Operation Paperclip in 1946. supposedly because the case files of the scientists chosen for the program had paperclips attached to them in the JIOA's office. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe was ending, the United States military identified roughly 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians whose expertise it wanted to extract from the collapsing Reich before the Soviets could get to them. The men on the list worked in rocketry, jet propulsion, chemical weapons, biological weapons, submarine design, electronics, and a dozen other fields where German research had been ahead of American research. Many of them were Nazi Party members. Some of them were SS. Some of them even had documented involvement in war crimes. The Joint Chiefs of Staff issued explicit orders that no active Nazis or war criminals were to be brought to the United States under any circumstance. The agency set up to manage the program was called the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the JIOA, an inter-service intelligence body that reported to the State War Navy Coordinating Committee. The JIOA's job, in theory, was to vet German scientists and ensure that the Joint Chiefs' orders were being followed. In practice, the JIOA's job was to make the paperwork on these scientists clean enough so they could be admitted to the United States despite the orders. The way they did this was by writing new biographies for them. Files were edited, party memberships were minimized or omitted completely, and SS commissions were left out completely. Where a scientist's involvement with the regime was documented in ways that couldn't be erased, the file would describe that involvement as nominal, ceremonial, or coerced, regardless of what the underlying record actually showed. The phrase the JIOA used internally for this process was bleaching. Bleaching the file. That word appears in JIOA memos from the late 1940s, and is being used the way you would use the word about laundry or stain on a tablecloth. There's no euphemism in it, because everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing. Wernher von Braun's file was bleached. So were the files of the most senior Peenemünde team who came over with him. Arthur Rudolph, who had been the operations director at Mittelwerk. The man personally responsible for production at the slave labor facility. The man whose name appears in survivor testimony as having been present during specific executions had his file bleached. He came to the United States and worked for the Army at Fort Bliss. Rudolph moved with a team to Huntsville. He eventually ran the Saturn V program at NASA, and in 1969, he received NASA's Distinguished Service Medal for his work on the rocket that took Apollo 11 to the moon. We will come back to Arthur Rudolph in the next act, because what eventually happened to him is the most important counterfactual part of the story. The Americans knew at the time, and they knew at every level of the chain of command. There are memos written by JIOA officers and surviving in the archives, in which the officers acknowledged that certain scientists' involvement with the regime was being deliberately understated for political purposes. The State Department raised objections repeatedly in writing, but was overruled. The Justice Department raised questions and was overruled as well. The Bureau of Investigations, the agency that became the FBI, raised objections about specific individuals, but they were overruled. The military argument was straightforward. The Soviets were going to get these men if we didn't, and we couldn't afford to let that happen, and the moral compromises required to prevent it were compromises that would have to be made. That argument was not crazy. The Cold War was just beginning. The Soviet Union had captured a substantial portion of the Peenemünde team's low-level engineers and technicians, the ones who hadn't made it south to surrender to the Americans. Soviet rocketry was advancing on the basis of that captured expertise, and by 1949, the Soviets would have an atomic bomb, and the strategic logic of getting German rocket talent into American hands rather than Russian ones was real and well-founded. None of that is in dispute. It's how global politics worked back then and still does. What is in dispute, or should be, is the cost of the laundering. Not the geopolitical cost, but the moral one. The Americans took men who had built weapons for Hitler using slave labor, men whose hands the war had not yet washed, and they made them American citizens. They gave them security clearances. They gave them senior positions in the most prestigious scientific program in American history. They did it by lying about what those men had done during World War II, in writing, on federal forms, with the knowledge of officials at every level of the government, from the JIOA up through the White House. And they made the lie permanent, because the bleached files became the official record. And the official record is what historians worked from for decades afterward. And the lie continued to function as the truth long after the men who told it were dead. Von Braun and the senior Peenemünde team arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas in September 1945. 4 months after Magnus rode his bicycle down the mountain. They were technically prisoners of war, but their conditions of confinement were unusual. They had a barracks of their own, they had access to the base library and the officers' mess. They were paid a small stipend for their work, and they were given technical assignments that were essentially extensions of what they'd been doing at Peenemünde. The Army wanted them to assemble and launch captured V-2 components at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, partly to learn the rockets and partly to develop the next generation of American missiles. For 5 years, they lived in a kind of limbo, neither prisoners nor free men, neither Germans nor Americans. Their families were brought over in stages. Their movements were restricted, but those restrictions were loosened each year. They were not allowed to give interviews or publish in the open scientific literature, but they were allowed to attend church and take their children to the movies in El Paso. The arrangement was unprecedented, and the bureaucracy was making it up as it went. In 1950, the team was moved to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, which would become their home for the rest of their working lives. Huntsville at that point was a small southern town of about 16,000 people, known mostly for cotton and watercress. Within 20 years, it would have a population of more than 100,000, and the city would have rebranded itself, with a complete absence of irony, as Rocket City. The Germans built houses with their families, joined the local Lutheran church, learned how to drive American cars, and sent their children to American schools. They were becoming, in slow stages, American. In April of 1955, Wernher von Braun became Wernher von Braun, an American citizen. He was 43 years old. 10 years earlier, he had been a major in the SS. The naturalization ceremony was held in Huntsville with his American-born wife, Maria, and their daughter, Iris, in attendance. He raised his right hand and swore the oath. He was photographed, this time smiling. That photograph ran in the Huntsville Times the following day, and the article that accompanied it described him as a brilliant scientist who had come to America to help win the Cold War. There was no mention in the article of where he had been in 1944. There was no mention of Mittelwerk. There was no mention of Dora. There was no mention of the SS Commission, or the party membership, or the letter to Savatsky, or the production line under the mountain, or the bodies hanging from the crane. The bleaching had worked. A new biography created by the U.S. military had held. There's one more piece of this act. It is the piece that turns Wernher von Braun from a former Nazi scientist quietly working for the Army in Alabama into the most famous space evangelist in America. And that piece is named Walt Disney. In the summer of 1954, Walt Disney was preparing to launch a weekly television series called Disneyland, designed to promote his new theme park. The park, which would open in Anaheim the following year, was divided into 4 themed sections: Frontierland, Adventureland, Fantasyland, and Tomorrowland. Disney needed content for each of the 4, and Tomorrowland was a section he was struggling with. He wanted programming about the future of space travel, but he wanted it to be scientifically credible, the kind of thing serious scientists wouldn't laugh at. He wanted, in essence, an expert. The man Disney's producer eventually approached, on the recommendation of the science editor at Collier's magazine, was Wernher von Braun. Von Braun appeared in 3 Disney television episodes between 1955 and 1957. The first was Man in Space, which aired in March of 1955. The second was Man in the Moon, which aired the following December. The third one was Mars and Beyond, which aired in 1957. In all 3, von Braun appeared on screen in a suit with a model rocket beside him, explaining in his German accent how the future of human space travel would actually work. He explained orbital mechanics. He would explain the rocket equation. He explained how a wheel-shaped space station could generate artificial gravity, and how a manned mission to Mars could be assembled in Earth orbit, and how the first lunar landing would probably look. He was articulate, he was patient, and he was charming, and the German accent that the American public had spent the previous 15 years associating with newsreels of Hitler and Goebbels was being rewritten as the voice of the future. 42 million Americans watched the first episode. Man in Space was the most watched program on American television the week it had aired, and it's been credited by Eisenhower's science advisors with shifting American public opinion on the value of a federal space program. It was the most successful image rehabilitation of a former Nazi in the 20th century, and it was happening less than 10 years after the man on the screen had stopped wearing his SS uniform. That same period, Collier's magazine ran a series of cover features on the future of spaceflight, prominently featuring von Braun's writing, his diagrams, and his predictions. He wasn't just appearing in the magazine, he was the voice of it on these subjects. He was being positioned, with the combined cultural authority of Disney and Collier's and the United States Army behind him, as a visionary scientist who was going to take humanity to the stars. He was becoming, in American living rooms, the face of the future. Not a face of the future, the face. In October of 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, and the American response was something between panic and humiliation. The Soviets had gotten to space first. The Soviets had a working long-range rocket, the R-7, that was capable of reaching American cities. The American space program, such as it was, had been splintered across 4 different services and had nothing in development that could match what the Russians had just demonstrated. President Eisenhower, who had been resistant to a major federal investment in space, changed course. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was created in 1958, and the von Braun team in Huntsville was absorbed into it as the core of the new Marshall Space Flight Center. Von Braun was named the director. He was now being given resources at a scale he could not have imagined in Peenemünde. He had a budget that would eventually run into the billions. Von Braun had 10,000 engineers reporting up to his organization. He was being asked, essentially, to build the rocket he had been wanting to build since he was 17 years old in a field outside Berlin. He built the Saturn V. The Saturn V is the largest rocket ever successfully flown by anyone, and that record stands today, more than 50 years after its last flight. The rocket stood 363 feet tall, which is taller than the Statue of Liberty, including the pedestal. It weighed 6.5 million pounds at launch, of which roughly 90% was fuel. It generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, which is enough to lift the rocket and itself and an Apollo spacecraft and 3 astronauts off the surface of the Earth and onto a trajectory that would take them to the moon. The Saturn V flew 13 times between 1967 and 1973, and it never failed. It's the rocket that took Apollo 11 to the moon on July 16, 1969, with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins on board. Wernher von Braun was at Cape Kennedy that morning. He watched the launch from the firing room with the rest of the senior NASA leadership. When the Saturn V cleared the tower and began its long roll over the Atlantic, he wept. He had said for years that this was the moment he had been working toward his entire life. The dream he had at 13 with his mother's telescope. The dream he had at 17 in a field outside Berlin. The dream he had at 20 when Walter Dornberger first offered him the Army's money. The dream he had at 25 when General Dornberger told him at Peenemünde that today the spaceship had been born. All of it had been pointing at this rocket, and this launch, and this particular moment. This is also true. It's all part of the same story. Both things have been true for the entirety of the man's life, and they're both still true. The 13-year-old with a telescope and the major at Peenemünde, and the engineer in the suit walking the production line at Middelburg, the citizen in Huntsville with his hand on a Bible, and the man weeping on the ground in the firing room at Cape Canaveral are the same man. There's no version of the story where you get to keep some of it and not the rest. The US government had built him a new life. He built the rocket the US wanted. The trade had worked, and on the morning of July 16, 1969, both halves of the trade were paid. The men in the tunnel, 25 years earlier, were not invited to that ceremony. Chapter 4. Rudolph and What Was Coming. Wernher von Braun died of pancreatic cancer on June 16, 1977. He was 65 years old. He was diagnosed just 2 years earlier. He'd undergone surgery and a long course of treatment, and he stepped down from his position at NASA in 1972, partly because of declining health, and partly because the agency itself was changing in ways that didn't have room for him anymore. The Apollo program had ended in 1972 with the Apollo 17. The budget had been cut. The focus had shifted to the space shuttle, and the era in which a single visionary could lead a moonshot had given way to the era of program managers and procurement contracts. He had spent his last years working in the private sector at Fairchild Industries in Maryland, mostly giving speeches and serving on boards. The obituaries were respectful, in the way obituaries of famous men generally are. The New York Times called him a seminal figure in the conquest of space. The Washington Post led with the moon landing and worked backward from there. There was, in most of the obituaries, a passing reference to his wartime work in Germany, generally in a paragraph midway through the piece. There was no mention of Middelburg by name in any of the major American newspaper obituaries that ran in the days after his death. There was no mention of Dora. There was a brief reference in a few of the longer pieces to the V2 having been built under, and I quote, wartime conditions, which is the kind of phrase that does a great deal of work while saying almost nothing. He died at exactly the right time. 7 years earlier, in 1984, the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations opened a case against Arthur Rudolph. The Office of Special Investigations, or the OSI, had been created in 1979 inside the Criminal Division of the Justice Department, with a specific and narrow mandate. Its job was to identify Nazi war criminals living in the United States, build cases against them, and where the evidence supported it, strip them of their American citizenship and deport them. The OSI had been set up because by the late 1970s, it had become embarrassingly clear that the United States had, over the previous 35 years, admitted a substantial number of people whose wartime conduct should have made them ineligible for entry. The OSI was the mechanism by which the country was finally going to begin to deal with that fact, one case at a time and decades later. Arthur Rudolph, by 1984, was 80 years old. He was retired and living comfortably in San Jose, California. He had come to the United States in 1945 with the von Braun Group, on Operation Paperclip with a bleached file. He worked at Fort Bliss alongside the rest of the team. He had moved to Huntsville in 1950 and he became an American citizen in 1954, a year before von Braun did. He had arisen through the Army's missile programs and then through NASA, and from 1963 to 1969, he had been the project director for the Saturn V program at the Marshall Space Flight Center. He received NASA's Distinguished Service Medal in 1969 for his work on the rocket that took Apollo 11 to the moon. He retired in 1969 with full federal benefits and moved to California with his wife. His record in Germany had been extensively documented in the original camp files, in post-war trial testimony, and in the survivor accounts that had been accumulating in the historical literature for 40 years. Rudolph had not been a passive engineer at Mittelwerk. He had been the operations director, which meant he had been responsible for production schedules, for labor allocation, for the discipline of the workforce. He was present at executions by his own admission in OSI interviews, and he had ordered specific punishments. And he'd been part of the chain of decisions that determined how many prisoners were assigned to the production line and how hard they were worked. The evidence that the OSI had assembled was strong, and had been strong for a long time. The reason it was being acted on now, in 1984, was that the OSI had been working through its case backlog, and Rudolph's case was at the top of the queue. The OSI gave Rudolph a choice. He could fight the denaturalization case in federal court, where the government would present its evidence publicly, where his American citizenship would almost certainly be stripped, and where he would then be deported to Germany to face whatever consequences awaited him there. Or he could sign an agreement renouncing his American citizenship voluntarily, leave the country quietly, and avoid trial. The agreement included no admission of specific guilt. It was, in effect, a plea deal that allowed the government to remove him from the country without having to make his full case public. Rudolph signed that agreement. In the spring of 1984, he renounced his American citizenship, gave up his federal pension, and moved with his wife back to Germany. He settled in Hamburg, where he lived quietly until his death in 1996. The German government, for what it's worth, declined to prosecute him further on the grounds the evidence the OSI had gathered, while sufficient for a denaturalization proceeding under American immigration law, did not rise to the threshold required for a criminal conviction under German law 40 years after the fact. He was buried in Hamburg. The Rudolph case is the case that didn't happen to Wernher von Braun, and the only reason it didn't happen to him is that he was already dead. If von Braun had lived another decade, if the cancer had come 10 years later than it did, the OSI would almost certainly have opened a case against him. The evidence against him was at least as strong as the evidence against Rudolph, and in some respects, even stronger. The two of them had been at Mittelwerk together. They had used the same labor, they attended the same meetings, and they signed the same kinds of letters. The Savatsky letter alone, the one in which von Braun described personally selecting prisoners at Buchenwald for transfer into the Mittelwerk labor system, was the kind of documentary evidence that made OSI cases. The bleaching of his file, the representations on his immigration paperwork, the omissions about his SS commission and his party membership and his role at the camp were exactly the kinds of administrative violations that stripped Arthur Rudolph of his citizenship. They would have stripped von Braun of his too. He would have faced the same choice Rudolph faced. He would have been the man who took us to the moon, and in his 80s, being told by the United States Department of Justice that he could either fight a denaturalization case in open court, with the evidence becoming part of the public record, or sign a piece of paper renouncing the citizenship that he had taken in 1955, and leave the country he spent most of his adult life in. We obviously don't know what he would have chosen, but we do know what Rudolph chose. We know what the evidence was. We know that the institution that had protected von Braun for 30 years, the United States government, NASA, the entire apparatus of American space exploration, wasn't going to be able to protect him from his own paper trail forever. The papers were always going to be there. The Savatsky letter was always going to be there. Yves Bayonne was always going to be there. And his memoir that was published in 1985, the year after Rudolph signed his agreement, was the kind of timing that in another version of the story would have been very awkward for Wernher von Braun. But he had died 8 years earlier. So the awkward timing didn't arrive. The conversation never happened. The Saturn V is in a museum, and his name is on buildings, on streets, and on a research center in Huntsville that bears his full name. There's a Wernher von Braun Memorial Foundation, and there are scholarships in his name. The mythology of the Apollo program, which is a real and beautiful mythology that landed 12 men on the surface of another world, has him as one of its central figures, as the German genius who came to America and built the rocket that took us there. That mythology is not entirely wrong, and the Saturn V was real, and the genius was real. The mythology has just left out the parts that didn't fit. I want to come back to something here because I keep coming back to it. Two things have to be true at the same time, and this entire episode is an argument that they are. The first is that Wernher von Braun took human beings to the moon. The Saturn V worked and the engineering was real. The dream he had at 13 with a telescope was a real dream, and he made it real. The people who walked on the surface of the moon walked on it because of the work he did. That's a contribution to the history of the species that isn't erased by anything else he did. It's also not the only thing he did, and the erasure works in both directions. The people who tell you the moon landing was an unqualified American triumph have decided which part of his life to remember and which part to forget. The second is that the rocket that took us to the moon was a direct technical descendant of the rocket that killed children in a Woolworths in London on a Saturday afternoon in 1944. And the engineer who built it was the same man who walked the production floor at a slave labor facility where 20,000 people died. The Saturn V and the V2 were the same lineage. The team was the same team. The man standing at both of those was the same man. The hands that signed the Savatsky letter in 1944 were the hands that signed the launch authorization for Apollo 11 in 1969. There's no version of this story where one set of hands is clean and the other is not, because they're both the same hands, and they both did those same things. The honest answer is that the United States made a deal in 1945, the same kind of deal the German army had made in 1932, and the country got something extraordinary out of the deal. We got the Saturn V, we got the moon, we got a man who, for all the moral weight he carried, genuinely loved the work and genuinely did want to take humanity to other planets, and who in the end did exactly that. The cost of that deal was paid in 1944, in tunnels under a mountain in central Germany, by men whose names are not on any building in Huntsville and whose graves are mostly unmarked. That is the trade. The institution that made it was not Nazi Germany, and it was not the United States, because both of those institutions made the trade for the same reasons, on essentially the same terms. The institution was the rocket. Both regimes wanted what the rocket could do, and neither of them were going to ask too many questions about what it cost to build it. And the man who built it for either of them died before either of them had to answer for the question. He died at exactly the right time. The institution that protected him is still here. The men in the tunnel are still there too, and they've been there since 1944. We mostly don't look at them because looking at them costs something we haven't yet been willing to pay. Chapter 5. The Bicycle Again. I want to come back to that boy on the bicycle, because in a small way he is the whole story. Magnus von Braun was 25 years old on the morning he rode down that mountain road in May of 1945. He was an engineer too, although never as celebrated as his older brother, and he'd been part of the Peenemünde team since the late 30s. He was a fuel systems specialist, a competent technical man whose name doesn't appear in many histories because the histories are mostly about Wernher. After the surrender, he came to America with everyone else, on the same paperwork through the same channels. He worked at Fort Bliss with the team for a few years, and then he left the rocket business entirely. He took a job at Chrysler, designing automotive components in Detroit, and he stayed there for the next 30 years. He retired quietly and died in Phoenix, Arizona in 2003 at the age of 83. When he rode that bicycle down the mountain, he was carrying his older brother's career on his back, and he didn't know that. He thought he was negotiating a surrender that might or might not work. He thought the Americans might shoot him on sight because the war was still on and German uniforms were still being shot at on contact in many parts of the front. Magnus thought the Russians might catch up to the team before he could find anyone. He thought the SS, who had standing orders to kill the rocket team rather than let them be captured, might find them before the Americans did. The bicycle ride was, in his own words years later, the most frightening thing he ever did. And he had spent the war working in tunnels and watching test stands explode and surviving Allied bombing raids, so the bar for frightening was already high. What he was actually doing, what he didn't know he was doing, was completing a transaction that had been started 13 years earlier in a field outside Berlin, when his older brother took the German army's money. He was delivering the asset. He was riding down a mountain road on a borrowed bicycle to hand over the most valuable scientific prisoner of the 20th century to a country that was going to need that prisoner to win the next war, the Cold War, and to win the race after that, the one for the moon. He didn't know that the Americans were already waiting. Not on the road, but in Washington, where the JIOA had already begun planning Operation Overcast before the war in Europe had ended. The bleaching procedures were already being designed. New biographies were already being drafted. The administrative machinery that would turn a German major in the SS into an American citizen and a NASA director was already being assembled, and the only piece of it that was still missing was the man himself. The boy on the bicycle was riding into a country that was already ready to receive him. And the country was ready because powerful people in it had decided, before the war was even over, that they wanted what the man could build. That's how it's always worked. Someone valuable becomes inconvenient, or someone inconvenient becomes valuable. And the people in charge find a way to keep what's valuable and discard what's inconvenient. And they call the discarding by some other name. In 1945, the inconvenient thing was 20,000 dead men in tunnels under a mountain in central Germany. And the United States government discarded them. It kept the engineer. It built him a new life. It put him on a Disney program watched by 42 million Americans. It gave him a budget and a title and 10,000 engineers and a launch site at Cape Kennedy. It let him weep in a firing room while the rocket that he wanted to build his entire life lifted off and became the most famous American achievement of the 20th century. The trade was made and the rocket was kept, and the men in the tunnel were discarded. Almost nobody noticed at the time, and hardly anybody has noticed since. None of the people in this episode were simple. Wernher von Braun was a brilliant engineer who genuinely loved the work and a man who used slave labor to build his rockets. And as my dad says, he's also the guy that taught America how to count backwards from 10. Walter Dornberger was a career artillery officer who saw the future before almost anyone else did, and he built a program that killed civilians in 2 countries and prisoners in his own. Arthur Rudolph ran the Saturn V program and was forced to give up his American citizenship in his 80s because of what he'd done 4 decades earlier. Magnus von Braun was a frightened young man on a bicycle and the courier of a transaction that would let his brother avoid a reckoning his colleague would face 39 years later. And he never spoke publicly about whether he understood, in years afterward, what he'd been part of. The American government was a force of liberation in Europe, and the same government that lied on federal forms in order to bring Nazis into the country. And it was both of those things in the same year, run by many of the same people. The rocket went to the moon. It also fell in a Woolworths in London on a Saturday afternoon in 1944, on a queue of women buying saucepans, on 168 people who were dead before they heard the explosion. It also fell in a movie theater in Antwerp 3 weeks later, on 567 people who were watching a Gary Cooper Western. It was also the rocket that took Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins to the moon on a summer morning in 1969, while a man at Cape Kennedy who built it wept in a firing room. The same rocket, the same lineage, and the same hands. The men who built the rocket are buried in many places. Some of them are buried in Hamburg. Some of them are buried in the cemetery of Maple Hill in Huntsville with American military honors, with their names on headstones. Some of them are buried in mass graves outside the tunnel mouth at Mittelbau-Dora, where the bodies were stacked in the snow because the crematorium could not keep up, and the graves were never properly marked, and most of the names were never recorded. The men in the third category were the cost of admission to a future the rest of us got to enjoy, and the future is the one we're still living in. This episode is dedicated to all those who died at Dora. I'm Lorne Bregitzer with Everything is Gray. Thanks for listening. This episode has been written, edited, and produced by Lorne Bregitzer.